They put a bullet in him at 70 miles an hour. Not a warning shot, not a graze, a deliberate, calculated execution attempt on a rain-soaked highway outside Chicago at 2 in the morning. And when the car finally stopped spinning, when the metal stopped screaming and the glass finished shattering, the gunmen didn't call for help. They didn't panic. They walked out of the tree line in black masks, slow and certain, like men who had done this before and expected to do it again. The man crawling from the wreckage was bleeding from his shoulder, dragging one leg, trying to reach the ditch. They weren't rushing because they knew he had nowhere to go. That's when Naomi Mercer saw them. And instead of driving past, instead of doing what every reasonable person would do, she hit the brakes. If that were you on that road, bleeding in the rain while armed men walked toward you, what would you do? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And when you're done watching, leave a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that highway. The rain had been falling for 3 hours before Naomi Mercer even got the call. It came in at 11:14 at night. A juvenile red fox hit by a vehicle near the forest preserve on the western edge of Cook County. Possible spinal injury. The preserve's overnight ranger had already flagged it, which meant Naomi was the one going out. She was always the one going out. She didn't complain about it. That wasn't her style. She pulled on her jacket, grabbed her field kit, and climbed into the wildlife medical truck that the organization had let her outfit herself 2 years ago when she first took the lead paramedic position. The truck smelled like antiseptic and pine needles. She liked that combination more than she probably should have. The fox hadn't survived. She'd known the moment she reached it. 12 years of field work teaches you to read the signs before you even crouch down. The way an animal holds its neck, the particular stillness that isn't rest. She'd done what she could anyway, because she always did. And then she'd sat in the rain beside the animal for a moment longer than was professionally required, because that was also who she was. By the time she started back toward the city, it was past 1 in the morning. The highway was nearly empty, the kind of empty that makes you feel like the last person alive, where headlights are company and the radio is conversation. She had the scanner on low, old habit, and she was thinking about whether she remembered to lock her apartment door when the car appeared ahead of her. It wasn't just stopped. It was wrong. The angle was wrong. The position was wrong. The way the driver's door hung open was wrong. Naomi had seen enough roadside situations to recognize the difference between a breakdown and something else, and this was something else. She slowed down. That was her first decision, not to accelerate, not to call it in and keep moving, to slow down. She pulled onto the gravel shoulder and left her emergency lights running, not because regulations required it, but because her instincts did. She stepped out into the rain and reached for her flashlight without thinking about it. The beam cut across the wet asphalt and found the car. A dark sedan, front end crumpled against the median barrier, steam rising from somewhere beneath the hood. Then the flashlight found the man. He was on his hands and knees about 30 feet from the car, moving toward the ditch with the slow, grinding determination of someone who understood that stopping meant dying. His left arm kept collapsing, dark stains spreading across his upper body, diluted by rain but still unmistakably red. Naomi started moving before she finished processing what she was seeing. Hey, I'm a paramedic. I'm coming to you. Don't move. He looked up. She got 1 second of eye contact. Dark eyes, no panic in them, which surprised her because most people in that condition are past rational thought. And then movement at the tree line pulled her attention sideways. 3 men. Black tactical gear, weapons raised. The part of Naomi's brain that governed self-preservation screamed at her to get back in the truck. The part of her that had been pulling injured animals from impossible situations since she was 26 years old said, "You can process the fear later." She ran forward instead of backward. "Get up," she said to the man on the ground. Not a request. "Get up right now." "I'm not... my leg." "I didn't ask about your leg. Get up." She got her arm under his right shoulder. He was heavier than he looked, or maybe she was more tired than she'd realized. But she'd moved a 200-pound sedated black bear out of a flooded ravine 2 summers ago, and she hadn't quit then either. She got him moving. The first shot hit the asphalt 12 feet behind them. Not at them. Not yet. A warning or a miscalculation. She didn't take time to determine which. She hit the door of her truck with her hip, pulled it open, shoved the man inside with a force that she would later feel guilty about, and then she was behind the wheel with her foot already on the accelerator before the door finished closing. The truck lurched forward. Another shot, the rear panel. She felt the impact before she heard it. Naomi had grown up in the south side of Chicago. She had watched her older brother navigate corners that most people didn't survive navigating. She knew, in the way that certain people know things from experience rather than education, that fear and calm are not opposites, that the right kind of fear makes you very, very still inside. She was very still inside right now. She drove. Not fast. Not yet. Fast was visible. Fast was trackable. She took the first Forest Service road she knew of, killed the emergency lights, and let the darkness swallow the truck before she finally exhaled. "How many times?" she said. The man beside her was pressing his own hand against his shoulder with practiced efficiency. That detail registered somewhere in her mind and filed itself away. "Once," he said. "Shoulder. Through and through, I think." "You think?" It didn't feel like it expanded. You know what expanding rounds feel like? A pause. "I know what this doesn't feel like." She didn't push it. She pulled the truck to a stop at a ranger station she'd used twice before when she needed shelter during bad weather, grabbed her trauma kit from the back, and got to work. The station wasn't much. A single room, a folding table, 2 chairs, a wood stove that hadn't been lit in months. The kind of place that exists to be functional and nothing more. She got a light source going, got the man into a chair, and cut away the jacket without asking permission. The wound was manageable. Painful, serious if untreated, but manageable. She'd dealt with worse on animals and she'd assisted on worse in the field. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. "Don't pass out on me," she said. "I'm not going to pass out." "People say that." "I'm not people." She looked up at him briefly. He was watching her work with a kind of focused attention that she'd seen in exactly 2 types of individuals in her life: surgeons and soldiers. People who understood what it meant to be in a body and what it cost when that body failed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Doesn't matter. You just saved my life. I just moved you out of a dangerous position. Whether you live depends on the next 40 minutes. Names later." She reached for the antiseptic. "This is going to be unpleasant." His jaw tightened. He didn't make a sound. She finished the initial cleaning, packed the wound, and started the process of proper dressing while the rain continued to batter the roof above them. The sound was constant, almost rhythmic, and in any other circumstances it might have been peaceful. "The men in the woods," Naomi said, not looking up. "They weren't highway robbers." "No. They weren't panicked. They moved like they had a plan." "They did have a plan." "Were they going to succeed?" A moment. "Before tonight?" "Possibly yes." She tied off the dressing and sat back. Looked at him directly for the first time since she'd started working. He was somewhere in his 40s, she decided. The kind of face that had been handsome once and had since developed something better than handsome. A quality of having survived considerable things and emerged with all the sharp edges intact. "You're not going to tell me what this is about," she said. "You didn't ask." "I'm asking now." He studied her the way people study things they're not sure how to categorize. "You drove into gunfire to pull a stranger out of a ditch, without hesitation." I hesitated a little. "You really didn't." "Don't make that a bigger thing than it was. I saw someone in trouble." "Most people see someone in trouble and keep driving." She stood up, moved to the window, and looked out at the darkness and the rain. "Most people never have to know what they'd actually do. They get to keep the comfortable version of themselves." She turned back. "I just never had that option." Something shifted in his expression, barely visible, but she caught it. "My name is Naomi," she said, "and I'm going to need you to stay awake for at least another hour. After that, we'll figure out next steps." Next steps being, you call whoever you need to call to come get you, they come get you, and I go home and never speak of this again. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that she couldn't name. Not gratitude exactly, not calculation exactly. Something that was both of those things and neither of them. "That's not going to be possible," he said quietly. "Why not?" "Because they got footage of you on the highway." The attack was planned specifically near a camera blind spot, but there's a traffic monitoring system a quarter mile back. He said it like he was reciting a fact rather than delivering a threat. By now, whoever coordinated the ambush has your face. The rain kept falling. Naomi felt something that wasn't quite fear. She'd had a complicated relationship with fear her entire life, but was adjacent to it. A sudden weight. The specific feeling of a door closing behind you before you've fully walked through it. "Who are you?" she said. Before he could answer, they both heard it. The distant rumble of engines. Multiple engines. Coming down the forest road. Naomi reached for her flare kit without thinking. The man rose from the chair, not easily, but decisively, reaching for something at his hip that she realized belatedly was a weapon he'd kept concealed through everything. She stepped in front of him. "Don't." "Naomi, if you pull that weapon in this room, whoever comes through that door is going to see two threats. I need them to see one injured man and one medical professional. Do you understand me?" He stared at her. "Sit down," she said, and put it away. Slowly, with the expression of a man completely unaccustomed to following anyone else's instructions, he sat down and put it away. The engines grew louder. Lights swept across the windows. Naomi straightened, set her jaw, and moved toward the door. She'd talked her way out of tense situations before. Poachers, property disputes, territorial disputes between communities, and the wildlife reserves she protected. She'd never talked her way out of anything like this, but she was going to try because that was the only available option. And Naomi Mercer was not a person who accepted the absence of options. She opened the door. The rain hit her face. The headlights blinded her for a moment. Figures were emerging from black armored vehicles. She counted 4 vehicles without meaning to, old habit again. And then the figures were moving toward her and she was calculating angles and words, and whether there was any version of this that ended without violence. And then she heard it. The sound stopped everything. "Boss!" A voice from the nearest figure, urgent, almost breathless with relief. "We've secured the perimeter." Naomi went very still. She turned slowly. The man behind her, the wounded stranger she'd dragged from the highway, whose shoulders she'd packed and dressed, who had sat in her chair and followed her instructions, and looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, was no longer sitting. He was standing in the doorway behind her, and every single one of the heavily armed men who had emerged from those vehicles was looking at him with an expression that Naomi had only ever seen directed at one category of person, not respect, not loyalty. Something older than both of those things. Deference. "Stand down," the man said. His voice had changed. Not in volume, he was speaking quietly, but in texture. Like something that had been held in reserve had finally been allowed out. All of them responded instantly. Naomi's hand was still on the doorframe. She could feel the grain of the wood beneath her fingers with unusual clarity. One of those moments where the body suddenly decides to notice everything. One of the men near the vehicles spoke again, his accent clipped, Eastern European. "We came as fast as we could. We lost the ambush team in the preserve, but there are still—" "I know." The man behind Naomi touched her arm lightly. To move past her, she realized, not to restrain her. He stepped onto the threshold beside her. The rain found him immediately, and he didn't flinch. "Pull the vehicles back. I don't want them visible from the road." "Yes, sir." "And someone contact Marco. I want to know who authorized the route change." "Already done, sir." He turned to look at her then, and in the light spilling from the station, with the rain and the armed men and the armored vehicles, and the entire impossible reality of the last 3 hours pressing in around them, Naomi finally saw him clearly. "Your name," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Tell me your name." A pause. Not evasion. Consideration. "Adriano," he said. "Adriano Vescari." The name meant nothing to her, but the look on the face of the man who'd said boss, the look of someone who assumed she must certainly know, who couldn't understand how anyone could not know, that look told her everything she needed to understand about the magnitude of what she'd accidentally walked into. Naomi let go of the doorframe. She walked back inside the station, sat down in the chair he'd vacated, and stared at the folding table. Outside, she could hear orders being issued, engines repositioning, the organized movement of a small private army rearranging itself in the Illinois forest at 2 a.m. She had 12 missed calls on her phone. She hadn't even noticed. She sat there for a long moment, in the strange, specific silence that comes after the adrenaline drains and before the thinking starts. Then she looked at her hands, still steady. She almost laughed. Adriano came back inside and stood across the table from her. He was holding his shoulder the way people hold injuries when they're trying not to let anyone see how much something hurts. And in spite of everything, in spite of the armored vehicles and the gunmen and the word boss still ringing in her ears, that detail made him look momentarily, undeniably human. "I need to explain some things," he said. "Yes," Naomi said. "You really do." Adriano didn't sit down. That was the first thing Naomi noticed. Every other man who had come into that station, the ones who'd filed in briefly to confirm positions, to hand off a phone, to relay something in hushed tones, they all moved with the careful choreography of people who understood that space belonged to someone else. But Adriano stood at the table across from her like the table was his, like the room was his, like the rain outside was his, and he was simply allowing all of it to exist temporarily. It should have irritated her. It did irritate her. "The route I took tonight was known to 6 people," he said. No preamble, no softening. "My driver, my head of security, my consigliere, and 3 senior captains." He was looking at his own hand on the table, not at her. Or someone in that group decided tonight was the night. Naomi looked at him steadily. "And you're telling me this because you need to understand why I can't simply send you home." "Try telling me anyway." His eyes came up. "Because whoever orchestrated this ambush is still inside my organization, and they now know that you exist, that you helped me, that you saw their people." He said it without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with urgency. "They will not leave that unaddressed." "You mean they'll come after me?" "I mean they already have someone looking for your plates." Naomi felt the weight of that land somewhere behind her sternum. She didn't let it show on her face. She'd had years of practice keeping her face neutral in situations that were anything but. But it landed. "So what exactly are you proposing?" she said. "That you stay under my protection until I identify who's responsible and remove them." "Remove them." She repeated the phrase carefully. "I want to be very clear about what that means." Something moved in his expression. Not discomfort exactly, more like a man recalibrating. "It means neutralizing the threat. I'm a wildlife paramedic, Adriano. I treat injured animals and occasionally assist on human emergency calls in underserved areas. I am not equipped for whatever the word neutralize means in your world." She leaned forward slightly. "So when you say I'm staying under your protection, what you're actually saying is that you're bringing me into the middle of something that could get me killed in order to prevent me from getting killed. Do you hear how that sounds?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes." "And? And I don't have a better option to offer you." She sat back. Outside, one of his men said something in Italian, quick, clipped, a question, and another voice answered. The engines had repositioned the way he'd asked, and now the forest was quiet, except for the rain and the low murmur of organized men doing organized things. Naomi had grown up around organized men. Not like this, not this specific flavor of organized, but she'd understood from a very young age that there were people in the world who moved through it with a kind of weight that other people didn't have. Her father had been a union organizer in the 90s, and she'd watched him navigate rooms full of men who wanted things from each other in ways they'd never say plainly. She'd learned to read the space between words before she'd learned to drive. She was reading it now. "You feel guilty," she said. He blinked, just once, but it was enough. "I beg your pardon. Not about the ambush, about bringing me into this. You walked into this room a few minutes ago, and you stood there like you own the air, and then you explained the situation like a man who's decided something, but is hoping I'll reach the same conclusion without him having to say it directly." She tilted her head. "You feel guilty about what's happened to my life in the last 3 hours." A long silence. "I'm not accustomed to being read," he said finally. "I work with animals. They can't talk. You learn to watch instead of listen." She stood up. "Okay. Okay? Okay, I'll come with you, for now. Not because I trust you, I don't know you. But because I'm not stupid, and if someone already has my plate number, then going home is the worst possible move." She picked up her trauma kit and slung it over her shoulder. "But I have conditions." He waited. "I'm not a guest, and I'm not a prisoner. I move freely within whatever space you put me in. I have access to my phone. And the second, I determine that staying with you is more dangerous than leaving, I leave and you don't stop me." He studied her for a moment that stretched out longer than was comfortable. Agreed, he said. Just like that? You saved my life. The least I can offer is your autonomy. She almost said something sharp in response to that. She held it back. Then let's go. The vehicle they put her in was the kind of thing that existed in a separate category from ordinary transportation. Not flashy. Deliberately not flashy. But the weight of the door when it closed told you everything. The glass was thick in a way that wasn't about insulation. She sat in the back with Adriano on her left and a man she hadn't been introduced to on her right, mid-40s, a jaw like a closing fist, eyes that moved in patterns rather than landing anywhere specific. A security man. A good one by the look of it. Nobody introduced him. He introduced himself. Dante, he said. Not to Adriano, to her. Direct eye contact, brief. I'm his head of security. Naomi. I know. Of course he did. She turned to look out the window. They drove for 40 minutes. She counted the turns out of habit, left, right, under what sounded like a bridge, then a long straight stretch. And then the vehicle descended, and she understood they were going underground before she could see it, a parking structure beneath something large. The transition from outside air to recycled air was immediate and complete. The elevator was small and very fast. It opened directly into a space that Naomi had no framework for. Not an apartment exactly, not an office, a place that had been designed to function as both and succeeded at neither, or rather, succeeded at a third thing entirely, something that was about control and privacy in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows that should have shown the city but were currently screened, multiple workstations, 3 people already awake and working at 2:30 in the morning, a kitchen that had been used recently, and a medical setup in the corner that told her this sort of situation was not entirely unprecedented. The room at the end, Adriano said to Dante, who nodded and moved toward what she assumed was the back of the space. A woman approached them. 50s, maybe. Silver-streaked hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped caring about how it looked a decade ago. Reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. She looked at Naomi the way a doctor looks at a patient, categorizing, not unkindly, but without ceremony. This is Elena, Adriano said. She manages the household. Elena extended a hand. Her grip was firm and fast. You need dry clothes and food, in that order. I need my truck back at some point, Naomi said. We'll address that. Elena was already moving. Come. Naomi followed because the alternative was standing in the middle of a room full of strangers looking lost, and she refused to look lost. The room at the end of the hallway was simple, clean. A bed that had clearly never been slept in, an attached bathroom, a window with the screen engaged. Elena set out a change of clothes that were close enough to Naomi's size to suggest someone had made an accurate assessment quickly, and then she paused at the door. The kitchen is available to you, she said. The rest of the floor is not. Not tonight. Because of the traitor. Elena's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. Get some sleep. She left. Naomi stood alone in the room for the first time since she'd pulled onto that highway shoulder and decided to slow down. The sound of the rain was gone. The building absorbed everything. The silence was the expensive kind that made her ears ring slightly. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands again. They were still steady. She was starting to find that fact darkly funny. She did not sleep. She lay down because her body demanded it, and she stared at the ceiling and ran through the events of the last 4 hours with the methodical attention she gave to field assessments. What she knew. What she didn't know. What she needed to find out. What she needed to find out was considerable. At 6 in the morning, she heard voices. Not arguing, not yet, but the specific tone of men who disagreed with each other and were being very careful about it. She got up, dressed in the clothes Elena had left, and opened her door. The main room had more people in it now, 7, 8. She counted without being obvious about it. Several she hadn't seen before. Adriano was standing near one of the workstations, still in the same clothes, and the man across from him was someone who changed the energy of the room simply by existing in it. Older. Mid-60s, maybe. Silver hair, a suit that had been expensive once and now just looked like his own skin. He carried himself the way certain men carry themselves. Not like he owned the room, but like rooms had been built around him for so long that the concept of ownership didn't apply. This was someone Adriano trusted. She could tell by the way Adriano's shoulders were slightly less squared than they'd been with everyone else, which meant this was someone she needed to pay attention to. "She shouldn't be out here," the older man said. Not to her, to Adriano. In English, which meant it was intended to be heard. "Lorenzo." Adriano's tone was a warning wrapped in a name. "I'm serious. We don't know her. We don't know what she saw, what she heard, who she might—" "She saved my life." "She pulled you into a truck. That's not the same as loyalty." Naomi walked forward. Both men looked at her. She stopped at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate and far enough to be controlled. "Lorenzo," she said. "That's your name?" The older man looked at her with the patient condescension of someone who'd been dealing with unpredictable variables for 4 decades. "It is. I'm going to save us both some time." She kept her voice even. "I didn't ask to be here. I didn't ask to know any of your names or see any of your faces or be in this building. I pulled a bleeding man out of a ditch because that's what I do, and I am now apparently a target because of it. So the question of whether you trust me is about as interesting to me as the question of whether you trust the rain." She looked at him without blinking. "I'm going to do what I need to do to survive this situation, and then I'm going to leave. That's it. That's the full extent of my agenda." A silence. Lorenzo looked at Adriano. Something passed between them, fast, layered, the specific shorthand of 2 people who'd known each other long enough to have a language made of silence. "She's direct," Lorenzo said finally. "Yes," Adriano said. "She is." Lorenzo turned back to the workstation without another word to her. She understood that was as close to acceptance as she was going to get from him, and she moved to the kitchen to find coffee. By 8 in the morning, she had assembled a rough understanding of the situation from overheard conversation and the occasional direct exchange with Dante, who seemed to operate on a policy of giving people accurate information on the grounds that accurate information produced better behavior than false reassurance. The ambush had been meticulously planned. The route Adriano's car had taken that night was a deviation from his standard path, a deviation that had been communicated only 12 hours before. The window of coordination necessary to stage the highway attack, in that location, with that number of men, meant someone had passed the information within minutes of receiving it. Someone with immediate access. Someone in the inner circle. The captains were being brought in one by one, not confrontationally, subtly. A morning meeting reframed as a security debrief. Naomi watched from the kitchen area, nursing her second coffee, and observed the way each man carried himself walking in versus walking out. Most of them were genuinely alarmed. Most of them had the specific body language of people who'd woken up to bad news and were still orienting. One of them didn't. A captain named Caruso, she caught the name from a brief exchange, walked in with the contained energy of a man who already knew the shape of the day. He sat down, answered questions, showed appropriate concern in all the right places. His expressions tracked 2 beats behind his words, the way an actor's emotions track 2 beats behind a line reading when the actor is technically good but not instinctively present. Naomi set down her coffee. She found Dante in his hallway outside the bathroom. She almost walked past him and then stopped. "The one named Caruso," she said quietly. "How long has he been with the organization?" Dante looked at her. Really looked at her, assessing, recalibrating. 11 years. "Is he close to Lorenzo?" A pause. "Careful. They work together on distribution." "Okay." She moved to walk away. "Why are you asking?" She turned back. "He's performing his reactions. The rest of them are having them." She watched Dante's face. "I'm probably wrong, but I thought you should know." She went back to the kitchen. 40 minutes later, Dante disappeared into the back room where Adriano had been most of the morning and didn't come out for 15 minutes. She didn't know what was said. What she knew was that 2 hours after that conversation, Caruso was quietly asked to remain in the building rather than return to his territory. The reason given was security protocol. His expression when he received that instruction lasted only a fraction of a second before he controlled it. But Naomi saw it. The thing about working with animals, the thing that most people didn't understand about that work, was that it wasn't about being an animal lover. It was about being a student of stress responses. Every living thing, under sufficient pressure, reveals the shape of what it's protecting. You just had to know how to wait for it. She was still thinking about that when the argument happened. It started in the back room and moved to the main floor in the way that arguments do when they've outgrown the space they were meant to be contained in. She heard Adriano's voice first, low, forceful, not raised but weighted. Then Lorenzo's, and this was different from the controlled patience she'd seen earlier. This was older. This was something that had been stored for a long time and was now finding its level. "You can't run this like a negotiation," Lorenzo said. He came through the door with his jacket unbuttoned, which was, she suspected, a significant departure from his baseline. "Someone tried to kill you last night. You respond to that with teeth, not procedure." "I respond to it by knowing who gave the order before I do anything else," Adriano said, following him. "If I move wrong, I kill the wrong person, and then whoever's actually responsible. Whoever's responsible is one of 5 people, and you know it. So you put all 5 of them in a room, and you make an example that nobody forgets. And if I'm wrong, if I execute 4 loyal men because of 1 traitor, then you execute 4 men." Lorenzo's voice was flat. Not cruel exactly, something flatter than cruel. "That's the cost of the position. You've always known that." "I've always known it. I haven't always accepted it." A silence. Something changed in Lorenzo's face. Something that Naomi, from across the room where she absolutely should not still have been standing, caught and immediately did not trust. "You've gotten soft," Lorenzo said, quietly. Not an accusation, a diagnosis. "I watched it happen. I kept hoping it was a phase." Adriano looked at the man who had, she'd gathered, been a fixture in his life since before his father died. Looked at him with something that might have been grief if grief in men like Adriano didn't have to go through several other emotions first. "Go get some rest, Lorenzo." "Adriano, go." Another silence. Lorenzo straightened his jacket. He turned, and in turning, his eyes found Naomi. They stayed on her for 1 second longer than was incidental. Then he walked past and down the hall, and the room absorbed his absence with the specific texture of a room that is pretending nothing happened. Adriano stood with his back to her for a moment. When he turned around, the weight in his face was different from what it had been the night before. Last night he'd been bleeding and calculating. Now he just looked tired. "You heard that," he said. "I wasn't trying to." "I know." He walked to the kitchen area, poured himself a glass of water, and stood with it without drinking. "Lorenzo has been with my family for 30 years. He ran operations for my father before I was old enough to understand what that meant." "He thinks you're weak," Naomi said. "He thinks I'm changing, which, in his world, amounts to the same thing." She watched him. "Is he right?" Adriano set the glass down. "Which part?" "That you're changing." A long pause. Outside, somewhere, someone's phone went off briefly before it was silenced. The building around them was full of the controlled sounds of people working very hard to manage a situation that had, in the last 10 hours, degraded significantly. "I don't know," Adriano said. He said it like a man who was surprised to hear himself saying it. "I genuinely don't know." Naomi nodded. She didn't offer comfort, and she didn't push further. Some silences were doing necessary work, and this was one of them. The day passed in the tense rhythm of a place under pressure. More people moved through, calls were made. She stayed out of the way as much as possible and paid attention to everything she couldn't avoid seeing. She was building a picture. Not deliberately, not with any plan in mind, but the way she always built pictures. Piece by piece, detail by detail, with the patient accumulation of someone who knows that the full shape takes time to appear. By afternoon, 2 things were clear to her. 1. Caruso was not the architect of the ambush. He was a piece of it, possibly a small piece, but the scale of what had been coordinated the previous night required a level of access and planning that someone of Caruso's position simply didn't have. 2. Whoever had planned it had done so with a sophisticated understanding of how Adriano made decisions, how he prioritized, and most importantly, how he could be made to hesitate. The attack hadn't been designed to simply kill him. It had been designed to make him reactive, to push him into making moves that could be predicted and countered. She was sitting with this thought when Elena found her with a quiet knock and a plate of food she hadn't asked for. "You should eat," Elena said. Naomi took the plate. "Thank you." She paused. "How long have you worked here?" 12 years. With Lorenzo? Elena's hand stilled for just a moment. He was here before me. Most people were here before me. She smoothed the front of her jacket. Eat. She left. Naomi ate without tasting the food. She spent an hour thinking about what she knew about tranquilizers. This was not a non sequitur in her head. It had been circling since the highway, since the moment she'd looked at the man crawling from the wreckage and noticed the particular quality of his movements. He'd been coherent in a way that was inconsistent with pure shock. She'd assumed adrenaline. But now, pulling the detail out and looking at it properly, she wondered. She thought about the glass vial she'd noticed on the highway asphalt when she'd first approached. She'd registered it subconsciously. Her brain had filed it with the debris, the glass, the twisted metal. But it was the wrong shape for automotive debris. It was pharmaceutical, and it had been positioned near the driver's side, not the impact side. Someone had dosed Adriano before the ambush. Not lethally, not something that would incapacitate him before the staged crash, because that would eliminate the appearance of an accident. Something calibrated. Something designed to slow his reflexes just enough to ensure he couldn't defend himself when the gunman emerged. That required pharmaceutical access. Specifically, the kind of access that wasn't commercial or medical. She was still sitting with this when her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway, because you answer unknown calls when you're in an unfamiliar building surrounded by people you don't know. Ms. Mercer. A man's voice. Older, controlled. I understand you've been having a difficult night. She kept her voice level. Who is this? Someone who would like to offer you a way out. There's a car waiting 1 block north of the building you're currently in. Come alone in the next 20 minutes, and you'll be home before noon, with enough money to make this very easy to forget. Her heart was doing something complicated. And if I don't? Then I'm afraid your situation becomes considerably more permanent. A pause. I don't mean that as a threat, Ms. Mercer. I mean it as an honest assessment of the forces currently in motion. She looked across the main room. Adriano was on a call, back turned. Dante was reading something on a screen. Nobody was watching her. How do you know where I am? She said. The voice was quiet for a moment. Because I put you there, it said. The call ended. Naomi sat with the phone in her hand and the silence rushing back in around her, and for the first time since she'd slid off that highway shoulder into the worst decision of her life, she felt something that she could only call by its honest name. She was terrified. Not of the men outside, not of the building she was in, or the man who owned it. She was terrified because she had just understood something that shifted the entire shape of the night, of every hour since the accident, every decision, every conversation, into something else entirely. Someone had planned for her to be here. Her presence in this building was not an accident of circumstance. It was a variable that had been accounted for, possibly engineered, which meant the man on the phone knew things about her before last night, knew her route, knew her habits, knew that she would stop. She stood up and walked, very calmly, to where Adriano was finishing his call. She waited for him to lower the phone. Something just happened, she said, and I need you to listen to me very carefully. Adriano looked at her for exactly 2 seconds before he turned to the room and said, Out. Nobody argued. Nobody asked questions. The people who had been working at the stations gathered their things with the practiced efficiency of people who had been cleared out of rooms before, and within 40 seconds, the main floor held only the two of them and Dante, who had positioned himself near the door with his hand at his side. Naomi told them what had happened. All of it. The call, the voice, the offer. The car 1 block north. She recited it the way she recited injury assessments, in sequence, without editorializing, with the specific details placed where they mattered. When she got to the last part, because I put you there, Adriano's face went very still. Not blank. Still. There was a difference. Blank was the absence of expression. Still was an expression that had been brought under control by considerable force. Play it back, Dante said. It was a call. I don't have a recording. The number. She showed him the phone. He photographed the screen without touching it and sent the image somewhere in a motion so practiced it barely looked like a motion at all. Adriano turned away from both of them. He stood at the window. The screen was still engaged, showing nothing, and she watched his reflection in the dark glass. His jaw was working slightly. He was doing math in his head, or something that functioned like math. The kind of internal calculation that required the body to go quiet while the mind moved fast. He said, "He put you there," Adriano said, still facing the glass. Those words exactly. Those words exactly. Not that he knew where you were, not that he'd been watching, he put you there. Yes. A silence. Then the ambush wasn't meant to kill me, he said. I don't think so. No. He turned around. The tiredness she'd seen earlier was gone, or rather, it had been reorganized into something with harder edges. Walk me through your reasoning. She did. The vial on the highway. The calibrated dose. Enough to slow him, not enough to incapacitate before the staged crash. The precision of the gunman, who had fired one warning shot and then held their position when she'd moved toward him. She'd assumed at the time that she'd surprised them. Now she thought they'd let her move. You were supposed to pull me out, Adriano said. Not a question. You were supposed to survive the ambush with exactly the kind of wound I could manage in the field. In a location close enough to the ranger station that I'd go there. And then you were supposed to trust me, a stranger who'd just saved your life, enough to bring me into this building. Dante made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He moved to one of the stations and started working with both hands. He needed eyes inside, Adriano said, or access, or something I have or know or can do that he needs. She looked at him steadily. I don't know which one, but the highway wasn't a coincidence, and I wasn't a coincidence, and whatever happens next, I'm not incidental to it. Adriano sat down. First time she'd seen him do that without being pushed toward it by blood loss. He sat down and put his hands on the table and looked at them, and she understood that the situation had just become something different from what he'd been managing for the last several hours. The frame had changed. Who knows your work, he said. Your specific work. What you do. What you can access. I run a wildlife medical program. I have access to controlled substances through a licensed contractor. Tranquilizers. Sedatives. Certain pharmaceutical compounds that are tightly regulated for veterinary use. She paused. The kind of thing that's difficult to source through normal channels. But not through you. I don't supply anyone with anything. My access is documented and audited quarterly. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. Through my contractor, theoretically, someone with money and a reason could source compounds that don't move through commercial or medical pipelines. She said it carefully. I'm not saying I was used for that. I'm saying that's the only piece of my professional life that has any value to someone like... She stopped. Like me, he said. Like whoever is doing this. Dante looked up from the station. The number is a relay. Third-generation reroute, which means it was prepared in advance, that this wasn't a spontaneous call. He pulled up something on the screen that Naomi couldn't read from where she stood. Someone built this infrastructure before last night. This whole thing was assembled over weeks, minimum. The contractor, Adriano said, and looked at Naomi. His name is Gerald Park. He's been my licensed supplier for 6 years. He runs a private wildlife research operation out of a facility in DuPage County. Clean record. I've never had a reason to question him. Did you call him last night, before you went out? Standard procedure. We log all controlled substance use before field deployment. I called in the sedative kit at 10:40. So he knew you were going out. She felt the floor shift slightly under the conversation. He knew I was going out. He didn't know my route. I determined my route in the field based on conditions and response priority. But he knew the timing. Yes. Adriano looked at Dante. Dante was already reaching for another device. The next 2 hours moved the way bad hours always move. Too fast in the moments that required slowness, too slow in the moments that required action. Dante's people pulled Gerald Park's financial records through channels that Naomi didn't ask about and didn't want to know about. She sat in the kitchen and drank another coffee that she didn't taste and listened to the controlled urgency of the room around her and waited. She was good at waiting. She'd learned it from the field, that the moment you pushed an injured animal into responding before it was ready, you lost it. You waited. You held the space. You let the information come to you instead of going after it. What came to her was this. Gerald Park had received 3 wire transfers in the past 4 months, routed through 2 shell entities in separate jurisdictions. Total amount significant enough that Dante read it twice before he said the number out loud, and even then he said it quietly. The source of the transfers was an investment holding company. The investment holding company was one of 11 entities listed as financial partners in a proposed acquisition of Adriano's legitimate real estate holdings. Naomi didn't know what that meant in the full operational sense, but she watched Adriano's face when Dante showed him the connection, and she understood that it meant something large. Foreign investors, Adriano said. The holding company is registered in Luxembourg. Parent entity is Latvian. Dante set the tablet down. But the operational signatures, the way the transfers were structured, the timing, these are consistent with a group we flagged 18 months ago, Eastern European Consortium. They've been trying to buy into the Chicago market through legitimate channels for 3 years. And when legitimate channels failed, they apparently decided to remove the obstacle. Adriano stood up. He walked to the window again. The same window, the same posture. And Naomi thought that this particular view, even with the screen engaged, must serve some function for him. A place to put his eyes when his mind needed to work without an audience. They need the pharmaceutical access, he said. Park was their supplier. They needed a way to ensure the compound reached me without tracing back to them. They used Naomi's contractor as the source, Dante said, and engineered her presence on the highway as a delivery mechanism. The sedative was already in the car. In the car, Naomi said slowly. In the car before the ambush. We found trace compounds in the ventilation system when we processed the vehicle this morning. We didn't know what we were looking at. Dante looked at her. Aerosolized. You wouldn't have needed to be dosed separately. Anyone in that car for more than 20 minutes would have been affected. Naomi sat with that for a moment. The driver. Adriano's driver had been in that car. Where is the driver? She said. The silence that followed had a texture. He didn't survive the crash, Dante said. She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. So they dosed everyone in the car. The crash was real, not fully staged. They needed it to be real enough that the driver couldn't respond to the gunman. She looked at Adriano. And you were supposed to survive because they needed you functional enough to be pulled out, to be moved, to end up somewhere accessible. Here, Adriano said, or wherever I took you. They assumed I'd call for help eventually, or that your people would track you. Either way, the sedative would still be in your system when you arrived. She stood up. Gerald Park. He would know the duration, the dosage, exactly how long the compound stays active before it clears. Dante was already on his phone. What happened next happened fast. Gerald Park was located at his facility in DuPage County. 2 of Dante's people were there within 40 minutes. Park did not run. He did not, by the account that came back through Dante's earpiece, express any surprise when they arrived. He asked only one question, which was whether Naomi was alive. When they told him yes, he said, "Then I'll talk." Adriano took the call himself. He put it on speaker without asking her, which she chose to interpret as inclusion rather than oversight. Park's voice through the phone was the voice of a man who had made a decision some time ago and had been living inside the consequences ever since. Not remorseful, exactly. Resigned. Like a man who had miscalculated the weight of something and had been carrying it wrong for months. They came to me 14 months ago, Park said. I told them no. Then they showed me what they had on me. A pause. Tax evasion. 18 years of it, small amounts, but consistent and documented. I'd have lost the facility, the license, everything. Another pause, shorter. I told myself the compound was just a sedative, that nobody was going to die. My driver died, Adriano said. A silence from Park's end that lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. I didn't know about the driver. They told me the dosage was calibrated for one person. His voice cracked slightly. Not for effect. She'd heard performed remorse before, and this wasn't it. I should have known better. I've been telling myself that for months. Who contacted you? Adriano said. A name. I only ever dealt with one person. He called himself Caruso. Naomi went very still. Across the room, Dante looked up from whatever he'd been doing and found Adriano's eyes. Caruso gave you instructions, Adriano said. Caruso gave me the target parameters and the timing. The compound formula came from somewhere else. Someone with pharmaceutical knowledge well above my level. I just provided the access and the cover. Park's breathing was audible. There's something else. Say it. The woman, Naomi Mercer. They didn't choose her randomly. Someone gave them her name 8 months ago. Someone who knew her work, her habits, her schedule. Someone who described her as, he seemed to be reading or recalling, someone who would not drive past. The room absorbed that sentence. Naomi heard her own heartbeat for a moment, clear and specific and slightly too fast. Someone who knew me, she said. Not to Park, to the room. 8 months ago. That's what I was told, Park said. Adriano ended the call. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood with the phone in his hand and his back to the window, and the particular stillness she'd come to recognize as his version of high-intensity thought. And then he said, very quietly, to Dante, "Pull Lorenzo's communications. Everything. The last 12 months. Dante didn't move for a full second, which, for Dante, was extraordinary. "You're sure?" Dante said. "I'm not sure of anything. Pull them." Dante left the room. The door didn't close behind him because he was already on the phone before he cleared the threshold, and Naomi was left in the main room with Adriano and the weight of what had just been suggested settling over everything like weather. "Lorenzo," she said. "Don't." His voice was flat. "Not yet." He was the one who... "I said not yet." He turned away. "I need it to be evidence, not instinct. I need it to be something I can stand on." She understood that. She didn't push it. But she also didn't take her eyes off his back, because she was watching something happen to him that she'd seen happen to exactly 0 people in her professional life, and hadn't expected to see now. The specific process of a foundational thing coming loose. The way a structure sounds different once something load-bearing has been compromised. It took Dante 47 minutes. She knew because she counted. She was still sitting in the kitchen when he came back, and the look on his face was the kind of look that experienced people get when they've confirmed something they were hoping was wrong. He handed the tablet to Adriano. She couldn't see the screen from where she sat. She could see Adriano's face. She'd watched him bleed on the floor of a ranger station without making a sound. She'd watched him sit across from Lorenzo this morning with grief in his eyes and a wall in front of it. She'd watched him process, in the space of 2 hours, the discovery that his entire organization might be compromised, that a woman he'd never met had been engineered into his life, that his driver was dead because of a plan someone had spent over a year building. None of those moments had looked like this one. This one looked like something breaking. Not dramatically, not with any outward gesture. His face didn't crumple and he didn't make a sound. It was something behind the eyes that went out briefly, like a light that flickers when the power source is interrupted and then comes back, but different. Running on something other than what it had been running on before. He set the tablet down on the nearest surface and walked to the window one more time. "He's been in contact with the consortium for 16 months, he said. "The communications are encrypted, but our protocol uses proprietary keys. He thought that was enough." A pause. "He also authorized the route change that brought my car onto the highway last night. The one that only 6 people knew about. He was one of them." Naomi didn't say anything. "He raised me," Adriano said, "after my father. He was the person who told me that loyalty was the only thing that held any of this together, that without it, everything collapses." He stopped, started again. "He told me that the night of my father's funeral. I was 23 years old, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said that the only thing a man could build that lasted was the trust of the people around him." His voice was entirely level. "He said that to me, and then he spent 16 months building the architecture of my death." Naomi stood up and walked to him. Not to comfort him. She didn't think he wanted comfort, and she didn't have any to offer anyway. She stood near him because it seemed wrong to let that sentence exist in an empty space. "What are you going to do?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. "I need to think." "Adriano." "I need..." He stopped, pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. "Give me a minute." She gave him the minute. It was during that minute that the first explosion went off. Not close, somewhere below, muffled by floors and concrete and whatever materials the building was made of, but unmistakable. The kind of sound that your body recognizes before your mind does. Naomi felt it in her sternum. The lights in the room flickered once, stabilized. Dante was on the phone immediately. 2 words in Italian, then switching to English. "Which floor?" A pause. "Get everyone to the secondary point. Now." Another explosion, closer. Naomi felt this one in her teeth. Safe houses, Dante said to Adriano. 3 of them have gone up in the last 10 minutes. They're systematic. They're working through the network. Adriano turned from the window. He was entirely present now. Whatever had been breaking had been set aside with a speed that was almost alarming to witness. Perimeter? Compromised. Lorenzo's people have our security layout. They know every position. How many do we have in this building? 11. 12 with me. Get them! The door to the main room opened and one of Dante's men came through at a pace that said everything before he opened his mouth. He spoke in rapid Italian to Dante, who listened without interrupting, and then Dante looked at Adriano with the expression of someone delivering something that cannot be softened. Caruso's team took Marco, Dante said. Marco? She'd heard the name that morning, one of the captains Adriano trusted. And Reyes, another name. 30 minutes ago. We're just getting confirmation. Alive? For now. Adriano looked at the man who'd delivered the message. Where is Lorenzo? A pause. A very specific kind of pause. He left the building 40 minutes ago, the man said. We believed it was authorized. The silence in the room was complete. 40 minutes ago. While Dante was pulling communications, while she and Adriano were in the main room absorbing the shape of the betrayal. Lorenzo had left, which meant Lorenzo had known they were close to finding it, which meant someone in the room had... My phone, Naomi said suddenly. Both men looked at her. When Dante photographed the unknown number on my phone, he sent the image somewhere, through a network that Lorenzo had access to. She looked at Adriano. He knew we were pulling threads. He knew how close we were. That's why he moved now. Not because he was ready, but because he had to be. Dante's jaw tightened in a way that said she was right, and he just arrived at the same conclusion 2 seconds behind her. Adriano looked at her for a long moment. In his eyes was the specific exhaustion of a man whose architecture has been dismantled from the inside out, who has spent 16 months being outmaneuvered by someone he loved, who is now standing in a building that his enemy knows better than he does. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen, held it out slightly so she could see the name on the display. Lorenzo. He answered it. Put it on speaker, said nothing. Lorenzo's voice came through the phone exactly as it had been in that room this morning, measured, patient, with the specific authority of a man who has decided that the shape of events is now his to determine. I've been watching you try to hold this together since your father died, Lorenzo said. I gave you 13 years. I did. A breath. But you've been walking away from this for the last 3, Adriano. You just didn't know how to say it. So I decided to say it for you. By killing me, Adriano said. By replacing you with something sustainable. The consortium provides infrastructure we've needed for a decade. What they wanted in return was manageable. A pause. You were the unmanageable part. And Naomi. A slight change in the quality of the silence. A necessary mechanism, Lorenzo said. The pharmaceutical access needed a human variable. She was the cleanest option. Her profile indicated she'd respond predictably. Another pause. She was supposed to deliver you and disappear. The fact that she's still there is a complication I'm prepared to address. Naomi felt the cold move up her spine cleanly and completely. If you want to address it, Adriano said, his voice dropping to something that was barely above conversational, you'll need to come back here to do it. I won't be doing that. A brief pause. Come to me. Alone. I have the people you care about, and I have the evidence that makes the difference between your organization's controlled transition and its catastrophic collapse. Come alone within 2 hours, or I start making permanent decisions about the things you value. The call ended. Adriano set the phone on the table. Dante started to speak. Adriano held up one hand, not sharply, but with the absolute authority of someone who needs the room silent for exactly this moment, and Dante stopped. Adriano looked at Naomi. She looked back at him. Between them was the accumulated weight of 22 hours. The highway, the ranger station, the building, the calls and the names and the explosions, and Lorenzo's voice on the phone describing her as a mechanism, a variable, a clean option. And underneath all of it was the fact that neither of them had chosen any of this, and both of them were now inside it past the point where choosing differently. Adriano moved first, not toward the door, toward the table. He pulled the tablet toward him, looked at Dante and said, "The steel mill on Lakeshore, the one we shut down 3 years ago." Dante's eyes narrowed. "You think that's where he is?" "It's where my father used to conduct final meetings. Lorenzo knows that. He'd choose it deliberately, to make a point about continuity, about who gets to define the legacy." Adriano set the tablet down. "He's theatrical when he believes he's already won. I'll mobilize—" "No." Dante stopped. He said, "Come alone." Adriano looked at him steadily. "If I come with soldiers, he executes Marco and Reyes before we breach the perimeter. He's been inside this organization long enough to know every approach vector, every tactical response we'd run. He's already accounted for it. Then you walk in and he kills you." "Maybe." "Adriano, get me a vehicle, one driver, and give me 20 minutes." Dante looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has given his professional life to keeping someone else alive and is now being asked to do the opposite of that. Then he turned and walked out without a word, which was, she understood, his version of compliance under protest. Naomi had been standing against the kitchen counter through all of this. She straightened now. "I'm coming with you." Adriano looked at her. "That's not possible." "You just said someone who comes with soldiers gets people killed. I'm not a soldier." She held his eyes. "I'm a wildlife paramedic who spent 16 months being used as someone else's tool without knowing it. I think that entitles me to be in the room when this ends. It entitles you to go home. I don't have a home to go back to yet, not until this is finished." She pushed off the counter. "And you're going to need a medical resource. You're running on a packed shoulder wound and 40 hours without sleep. If something goes wrong, you being there makes it worse. If something goes wrong and I'm not there, you bleed out in an abandoned building and nobody finds you until morning." She picked up her trauma kit from where it had been sitting since Elena brought it from the first room. "I'm coming." The specific silence that followed was the kind that contained an argument he'd already decided not to have. "Stay behind me," he said, "at all times." "Understood. If I tell you to run, you run. No discussion." "Agreed." "And Naomi." He waited until she met his eyes fully. "Whatever you see in there, whatever Lorenzo says, whatever he's built the last 16 months into, you hold your judgment until it's over. This is not a situation that benefits from improvisation." She looked at him and thought about telling him that the last 22 hours had been nothing but improvisation. That improvisation was the only reason either of them were standing here having this conversation. She held it back. "Okay." They went downstairs. The vehicle Dante had arranged was unremarkable, deliberately, pointedly unremarkable, a dark sedan that looked like 10,000 other dark sedans in the city. The driver was a man whose name she wasn't given and didn't ask for, who drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes in a continuous circuit between the road ahead and the mirrors, and who did not speak once during the entire 40-minute drive to the lakeshore. The rain had stopped. The sky over Lake Michigan was the particular dark gray of early morning pressing against the inside of a storm system that hadn't finished moving through. The light was strange, flat and directionless, and the steel mill rose out of it the way things rise out of that kind of light, without ceremony, without drama, just suddenly present. It was enormous. She hadn't registered that initially, from the car, but as they got out and stood at the perimeter fence, she understood the scale of it: towers of corroded steel, catwalks at 4- and 5-story heights, the ribbed silhouette of the main processing building against the gray sky, like the skeleton of something prehistoric, broken windows and patterns, chain-link fencing that had been cut and reattached so many times it had given up on being a barrier. Adriano looked at the building for a moment. She couldn't see his face from where she stood just behind his right shoulder. He said very quietly to himself rather than to her, "All right." Then he walked forward. The main entrance was unlocked. The door swung open with the specific resistance of something that had been prepared. Hinges recently oiled, which meant someone had been here recently, which meant this location had been chosen and readied in advance. Another piece of the architecture. Another thing Lorenzo had built ahead of time. The inside of the mill was cold in a way that the outside hadn't been. The kind of cold that buildings generate from their own mass, from years of standing empty and absorbing the absence of heat. Their footsteps were immediate and specific on the concrete floor, and Naomi focused on controlling hers. placing each step with the same deliberate attention she used when moving through brush toward a frightened animal. Minimal noise, maximum awareness. The space opened up around them into the main processing floor. It was vast in the way that industrial spaces from another era are vast, built for a scale of human endeavor that doesn't exist in the same form anymore. Rusted machinery stood in configurations that no longer made visible sense. Catwalks crossed overhead at multiple levels. Light came through the high broken windows in flat, useless shafts. And from above, somewhere in the upper level, she heard a voice. "You came." Lorenzo, coming from the catwalk level, maybe 30 feet up. She couldn't see him yet. The acoustics of the space made direction difficult. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, which she suspected was not accidental. "Of course I came," Adriano said. He stopped walking and stood in the center of the floor, not looking up yet, looking straight ahead at the far wall. "Where are they?" A pause. Then movement on the catwalk above, and Lorenzo appeared at the railing, older than he'd looked in the building that morning, or maybe just reduced by the gray light. Or maybe she was finally seeing him without the performance of the morning layered over what was underneath. "They're secure," Lorenzo said. "They're fine. This doesn't have to be complicated." "A man is dead," Adriano said. "My driver. He had 2 daughters." A pause. "That wasn't intended." "And that makes it easier?" "It makes it a mistake. Mistakes happen. In 20 years of working beside you, I've watched you accept that fact in other contexts. You're capable of it." He leaned on the railing. From below, his posture read as relaxed. She didn't believe it was relaxed. "The consortium is prepared to formalize their offer. The terms are reasonable. You walk out of this business with your life, your legitimate holdings, and enough distance that nobody comes looking for you in 5 years. And the people who work for me transition. Most of them continue. The ones who don't..." He made a gesture with one hand that completed the sentence without words. "And Naomi." A silence. Lorenzo looked down and found her. She was close enough to Adriano's shoulder that she was part of the frame, and Lorenzo's eyes rested on her with the specific quality of a calculation completing itself. "She's a loose end," Lorenzo said. "I don't say that without regret. She was a tool. She didn't choose any of this. But she knows too much to be returned to her life and trusted to stay quiet." Naomi felt Adriano move. Not much, barely perceptible, a shift in his weight toward the forward foot, and she put her hand briefly on his arm. Just her fingers. Just enough. He stilled. "You raised me," Adriano said. His voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard from him before. Something below anger, below grief, something that occupied the place where both of those had been before they burned through everything flammable. "You put your hand on my shoulder the night we buried my father, and you said loyalty was the only thing that lasted. I meant it when I said it. When did you stop meaning it?" A long pause. "When I watched you slow down," Lorenzo said. "When I watched you start questioning things that don't benefit from being questioned. When you let her..." His eyes moved to Naomi briefly. "Challenge your decisions in front of your people. When I realized that the man I'd helped build was systematically dismantling himself." He straightened from the railing. "I didn't stop being loyal, Adriano. I transferred that loyalty to the thing you were supposed to be." "What I was supposed to be," Adriano repeated. "According to who?" "According to everyone who has ever depended on this organization to function. That's not loyalty, that's ownership." Lorenzo made a sound that might have been a laugh in different circumstances. "Come upstairs. We'll finish this properly." Adriano looked up at him for a moment. Then he started toward the stairs. Naomi went with him. The staircase was metal and narrow, and it rang under their feet despite every effort at quiet. 30 steps, approximately. She counted. She counted because counting gave her something to do with the part of her brain that was monitoring her own fear response, that was noting the elevated heart rate and the dry mouth and the particular tension in her legs that was her body's way of preparing to run whether she instructed it to or not. They came out onto the catwalk. Lorenzo was not alone. She'd known he wouldn't be. Adriano had clearly known as well. She could tell by the way his posture absorbed the presence of the 4 men positioned at intervals along the catwalk without any visible surprise. One of them was Caruso. He didn't look at her. He looked at a point approximately 6 inches to her left with the studied inattention of someone who has decided that making eye contact with a person they've helped target constitutes a line they'd prefer not to cross. Marco and Reyes were at the far end of the catwalk, zip-tied to the railing structure, both alive. Marco had blood on his face from something that had happened before tonight, and Reyes was holding himself with the rigid stillness of someone managing a rib injury, but they were upright and breathing, and their eyes were clear. Marco looked at Adriano with an expression she couldn't fully read from this distance. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than that. The look of a man who isn't sure whether rescue or sacrifice has just walked through the door. "Caruso," Adriano said. The man looked at him finally. "Adriano." 11 years. "Yes." "You were in my house. You were at my table." His voice was completely level. The leveler it got, she'd noticed, the more dangerous the thing underneath. "My daughter called you uncle." Caruso said nothing. "Was any of it real?" Not rhetorical, genuinely asking. Caruso's jaw moved. "Most of it," he said. "In the beginning, all of it." He seemed to be about to say something else, and then didn't. Lorenzo stepped forward. "Enough." He was carrying something. She hadn't noticed initially because his jacket was dark and the light was wrong, but the shape in his right hand was unmistakable when he moved. "Adriano, I need an answer." "You already have my answer." "I need the formal one. For the consortium. They're watching this in real time." He gestured toward Caruso, and she understood there was a phone involved, a camera, something recording or transmitting the exchange. "Give them what they need, and everyone goes home." Adriano looked at the phone in Caruso's hand, looked at it for a long moment, then he looked at Lorenzo. "You want a formal agreement. I want you to say, clearly, on record, that the transition is voluntary, that the organization acknowledges the new structure. It protects everyone. It protects the consortium's legal position," Adriano said. "That's what it does. It creates documentation that insulates them from criminal exposure." He nodded slowly. "You thought about this very carefully." "I've had 16 months. "You have." Something happened then. Something small and specific that Naomi caught because she was watching everything, because that was the only tool she had in this space, because she had no weapon and no leverage and no exit, and all she had was attention. She caught it and filed it away in the same instant, and it changed the shape of the next 30 seconds before those 30 seconds arrived. The maintenance panel behind Lorenzo. On the wall beside the secondary staircase at the far end of the catwalk. The cover was slightly displaced from its housing. Not much, maybe an inch, though, in a way that was consistent with it having been recently handled. And from the displaced edge, barely visible in the flat gray light, ran a thin wire that disappeared into the floor structure below the catwalk grating. She'd seen that configuration before. Not in this context. In field work. In situations where something had been set and was waiting to be triggered. She'd sabotaged 3 of those configurations herself in the last 2 hours. She hadn't told anyone. There hadn't been time, and the opportunity had presented itself during the one moment in the building when she'd been briefly alone near the maintenance workshop on the building's ground level. 3 minutes, maybe 4, while Adriano was in a phone call with Dante, and the guard near her had been distracted by one of Lorenzo's men arriving at the entrance. She'd been looking for something to use. She'd found the wiring for 4 separate explosive charges, clearly preset, clearly controlled by a remote detonator that was not currently visible. She had no tools, no formal training in ordnance. She'd had her hands and her field knowledge and the understanding from years of working with electronics and remote animal tracking equipment, of which components made a trigger mechanism function. She'd disabled 3 of the 4. The 4th had been beyond reach. She looked at the panel. The 4th charge was directly behind Lorenzo. Lorenzo was looking at Adriano. He had not looked at the panel. He didn't know she'd been in the building before them. Couldn't know, because she hadn't told Adriano either, because the plan she'd formed in those 3 minutes was fragile and partial and depended on variables she couldn't control. And explaining it would have required explaining why she'd gone near the maintenance section in the first place, which was a question she didn't have a clean answer to. The honest answer was that she'd looked at this building from the car, and she'd thought, this is the kind of place where a man who builds things in advance builds one last thing. And she'd gone looking, and she'd found it, and she'd done what she could with what she had, which was what she always did. I'm not going to give you the statement, Adriano said to Lorenzo. Not because I'm unwilling to walk away. I've been considering it for 3 years. You were right about that. But because what you're asking me to sign is a document that protects the people responsible for killing my driver. And I'm not going to do that. Lorenzo's hand came up. Not all the way. Not aimed. Just up and present. And the message was clear. Adriano. My answer is no. Naomi took 3 careful steps to her right. She was moving toward the far section of the catwalk, toward Marco and Reyes. And she moved with the deliberate non-urgency she'd used 10,000 times approaching injured animals. No sudden motion. Nothing that triggers a defensive response. Just a person slowly repositioning, slow enough that it registers as ambient movement rather than intention. Lorenzo's eyes tracked her briefly. His gun hand stayed where it was. Where is she going? He said. She's staying behind me, Adriano said, which had been the instruction he'd given her, which she was currently not following, which he said without missing a beat, in a way that told her he understood she was doing something and was buying her the time to do it. Stop her, Lorenzo said to Caruso. Caruso took 2 steps toward her. She turned to face him directly and said, very quietly, for his ears only, You said most of it was real. In the beginning, all of it. She looked at him. Is any of it real right now? He stopped. She held his eyes for 1 second. 2. The gun in his hand was pointed at the floor. Then she turned and kept walking. She reached Marco first. Her hands found the zip tie at his wrists, and she worked it. No tools, just pressure and positioning, the same technique she used on synthetic field restraints. It took 12 seconds. She knew because she was counting everything now, all of it, her entire world reduced to numbers and distances, and the sound of Adriano's voice behind her continuing to hold Lorenzo's attention with the specific gift of a man who knew how to take up space. You want control of something that doesn't belong to you, Adriano was saying. You've wanted it for a long time, long enough that you've confused wanting it with deserving it. I built it, Lorenzo said. I built it alongside your father, and then I built it alongside you. If anyone has a right, rights don't transfer through proximity. Don't philosophize at me, not here. Then what do you want from me? Genuinely. You've got the gun, you've got the room. What does the version of this look like where you walk out satisfied? Marco's hands came free. He made no sound. Professional stillness, she noted, the kind of stillness that comes from training. And she moved immediately to Reyes. The rib injury was worse than she'd assessed from a distance. He was breathing in the shallow, controlled pattern of someone rationing lung capacity. She worked the zip tie, felt the resistance of it, adjusted her angle. Above and behind her, she heard Lorenzo take a step forward on the metal grating. The sound was sharp and specific. Enough, he said. Different tone now. The patience had run out of it. Caruso, bring her back here. He's not going to do that, Adriano said. Caruso, he's not going to do it, Adriano said again, because you've been running him for 11 months, and in that time you've treated him like a mechanism. The way you treated Naomi, the way you treat everything you use. A pause. And he's been in this organization for 11 years. Those aren't the same number. A silence. Naomi got Reyes's hands free. She steadied him with one hand on his arm and looked at Marco, who was already moving, carefully, quietly, toward a position she couldn't predict, but that looked intentional. He knew this building. She didn't know how, but he knew it. Reyes leaned toward her. His voice was barely audible. Stairs, 40 feet back. Secondary exit at ground level east side. She filed it, did not look at the stairs. Caruso, Lorenzo said again. The word had weight in it now. A warning. The kind of warning that has a consequence attached. Last time. And Caruso said, without raising his voice, without any drama, no. The single syllable detonated the room as surely as any of the charges wired into the structure. Lorenzo turned. He turned to look at Caruso, and in turning, he briefly took his primary attention off Adriano, and in that fraction of a second, Adriano moved. Not toward the gun, toward Lorenzo. The distinction mattered. He wasn't reaching for a weapon, he was closing distance, which changed the geometry of everything. He got his hand on Lorenzo's gun arm at the wrist, before Lorenzo completed the turn, and then they were in contact, and the quality of the moment changed entirely. Naomi grabbed Reyes by the arm and pulled him toward the secondary stairs. Above her, On the catwalk, she heard the sounds of two men who had known each other for 30 years doing something that was the opposite of everything that knowledge was supposed to produce. Not clean, not fast. The labored, terrible sounds of close physical conflict between men who are both exhausted and neither of whom fully wants to be doing this. One of the other guards moved. She didn't see it. She was already on the stairs with Reyes, one step ahead of him, her hand back to keep him from stumbling. But she heard it. Footsteps on grating, fast, a shot. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. Her ears registered it as pressure more than sound. Reyes flinched but kept moving. She didn't stop to locate the shot. You don't stop. You move. Ground level. The floor was uneven, broken in places, and the light was worse down here. She pulled Reyes toward the east wall, the direction he'd indicated, scanning for the exit. Found it. A personnel door, rusted but present, with a push bar that resisted and then gave with a sound like something tearing. Cold air. Outside. The flat gray morning and the smell of the lake. She got Reyes through the door and turned back. Marco was behind them. He'd come down a different way. She didn't ask how. And he had a cut on his forearm that was bleeding seriously, but not catastrophically. He looked at her with a directness that she was not expecting. You disabled the charges, he said. 3 of them. There's a 4th. Behind Lorenzo, on the upper level. He pulled a phone from his jacket. The detonator is with Caruso. He had it the whole time. He was already dialing. He doesn't know the charges are partial. Neither does Lorenzo. They looked at each other. Adriano's still up there, she said. I know. She turned back to the door. Naomi. Marco's voice sharp. Wait for... She was already moving, back through the door, back across the broken concrete, back to the base of the staircase she'd come down 60 seconds ago, and up it, because Adriano had told her to run if he said run, and he hadn't said run, which she chose to interpret as standing permission to do everything else. The catwalk was in a different configuration than she'd left it. 2 of Lorenzo's men were down. She didn't take time to assess their status. Caruso was standing at the far end of the catwalk with his back to the railing, one hand extended toward Lorenzo, the other holding the detonator that Marco had described. His expression was the expression of a man who has committed to something that he hasn't finished committing to, which is the most dangerous kind of commitment. Lorenzo and Adriano were 6 feet apart. Lorenzo had his gun raised. Adriano had something in his right hand that she identified after 1 second as Lorenzo's phone, the one that had been recording, and he was holding it in a way that said he'd taken it at some point during the struggle, which meant the recording now contained whatever had happened in this building for the last several minutes. Lorenzo was bleeding from a cut on his face. Adriano's shoulder, the packed wound, the injury she'd dressed 12 hours ago in a ranger station, had soaked through his shirt. She got to the top of the stairs and stopped. The charges are disabled, she said. Her voice came out clear. She hadn't known it would. 3 of 4. The 4th is directly behind Lorenzo. Caruso has the detonator, and Lorenzo doesn't know the count is partial. Silence. Lorenzo turned his head just enough to look at her. Then at the panel on the wall behind him, then back at her, and she watched him process the information. The genuine uncertainty of a man who has just learned that the safety net he installed might have a hole in it. She's bluffing, Lorenzo said. To Caruso. Caruso looked at her. She looked back. She's not bluffing, Caruso said. Lorenzo turned fully toward the panel, 1 second of his back to Adriano. Adriano didn't take the shot. He had the angle. She could see it. The geometry was right. He could have ended it there, quickly, finally. He didn't. Lorenzo, he said. His voice was absolutely steady. Stop. Lorenzo turned back around. His gun was still up. His eyes had changed. The patience was gone, but so was the cold authority she'd seen since the phone call. What was there now was something rawer, something that, in a different life, in a different set of choices, might have been the face of a man who knew he'd lost something that couldn't be recovered. You should have taken that, Lorenzo said, just now, when my back was turned. I know. Why didn't you? Adriano held up the phone. The recording. 16 months of architecture and whatever the last 5 minutes had added to it. Because I need you alive, he said. And I need this. And I need to do this in a way that holds afterward. Lorenzo stared at him. Put the gun down, Adriano said. And we finished this the right way. The moment extended. Naomi was aware of her own breathing. Too fast, consciously regulated. The technique she used in the field when an animal was in the decision threshold between flight and surrender. When everything depended on the next 2 seconds, Lorenzo put the gun down. Not dramatically, not with any gesture that acknowledged the weight of the moment. He simply lowered his arm, and his fingers opened, and the gun met the metal grating of the catwalk with a sound that rang through the entire building. Once, sharp, then fading into the high empty space above them. And that sound was the sound of something ending. Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Adriano crossed the distance between them and picked up the gun without looking at Lorenzo, and the fact that he didn't look at him was its own statement. He handed it to Naomi without explanation, and she took it because there was nothing else to do with it, and the weight of it in her hand was unfamiliar and specific, and she held it the way you hold something that belongs to a world you're passing through rather than living in. Caruso set the detonator down on the railing carefully, like a man placing something fragile, and stepped back from it. Lorenzo stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Adriano, and the look on his face was something that Naomi would think about later, in quieter moments, when the whole sequence of the previous 24 hours came back to her in the way that extreme experiences do, in fragments, in sudden images at unexpected times. The look on Lorenzo's face was not defeat, it was not remorse. It was the look of a man who had been absolutely certain of something for 16 months and was now standing in the first moment of genuine uncertainty he had allowed himself. And the uncertainty was its own kind of pain. "The phone," Lorenzo said finally. His voice had lost its architecture. Just words now, without the structure he usually built around them. "How much did it capture?" "Enough," Adriano said. "Enough for what?" "Enough for federal prosecutors to understand the full shape of what was planned. The consortium, the pharmaceutical sourcing, the ambush coordination." Adriano looked at him then, finally, directly. "Enough for your own voice to explain every decision you made in your own words, without anyone having to interpret it." Lorenzo absorbed that. His jaw moved slightly. "You're going to hand me to the government." "I'm going to hand them everything, not just you." A pause. Something shifted in Lorenzo's expression, a flicker, fast, of something that might have been surprise before it was controlled. "You mean the organization?" "I mean all of it." Adriano put the phone in his jacket. "The accounts, the operations, the infrastructure, the names." He looked at Lorenzo steadily. "I've been trying to figure out how to end this for 3 years, and you spent 16 months building me the exit." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from all the silences that had come before it in that building. This one had the quality of something large settling into its final position. "You'll be destroyed," Lorenzo said. "Professionally, yes." "I don't mean professionally." "I know what you mean." Adriano didn't look away. "I've had this conversation with myself for a long time. I know what it costs." Lorenzo made a sound, not a laugh, not quite, but something adjacent to it, hollow and without humor. "Your father would—" "My father made his choices." The sentence was quiet and final and closed the subject completely. "I'm making mine." Marco appeared at the top of the stairs with 2 of Dante's people behind him. She hadn't heard them arrive. They'd come from below, from the east entrance she'd used, and they moved with the efficiency of people who had assessed the situation from the doorway and determined that intervention was no longer the primary need. One of them had a first aid kit. She almost laughed at that. Almost. She looked at Adriano's shoulder. The blood had spread further than she liked. "Come here," she said. "In a minute." "Now," she said. "It'll take 4 minutes, and your arm is going to stop working if you lose any more. Naomi." "4 minutes," she said. "You can conduct the rest of this in 4 minutes." He came. He sat on a piece of fallen structural beam near the staircase access, and she opened her kit with the same hands that had held a gun 2 minutes ago and were now the hands she recognized. Her hands, the ones she'd built a career with. And she worked. The dressing had held better than she'd expected. The secondary bleeding was from movement, from the physical struggle, from whatever had happened on the catwalk while she'd been below with Reyes. She cleaned it with what she had, applied fresh compression, and worked with the specific focused quiet that made this part of her life the most honest part of it. He watched her work. She was aware of it. She didn't acknowledge it. You went into the building first, he said. I was in the car before you. I walked faster. You disabled the charges. 3 of 4. You didn't tell me. There wasn't time. And if I'd told you, you would have factored it into your approach, and Lorenzo reads you better than you read yourself. He would have seen it. A pause. So you calculated that my genuine response to not knowing was more useful than my tactical response to knowing. I calculated that I had 3 minutes and a maintenance panel, and I should do something with both. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you. She tied off the dressing. Don't thank me yet. You need a real surgeon for this. The tissue damage from the original wound is more significant than I told you last night. You withheld medical information. I managed your anxiety levels so you could function. There's a difference. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. How are you, actually? The question landed differently from the clinical ones. He registered that. She could see it in the brief change in his eyes. Not discomfort. Something more like the look of a man being addressed in a register he hadn't expected. I don't know yet, he said. I won't know for a while. She nodded. That was the honest answer. She respected it. Dante arrived 20 minutes after the operation on the catwalk concluded. She didn't know what Dante had been doing in those 20 minutes, but the efficiency with which law enforcement vehicles appeared at the perimeter of the building, unmarked federal plates, the kind of coordination that didn't happen without significant advance preparation, told her that Adriano's decision to end this through legal channels had not been made in the last hour. He'd been building toward it. The recording was the final piece, not the first. He'd been dismantling his own organization from the inside, slowly, for 3 years. Lorenzo had called it weakness. Naomi thought it was the most exhausting kind of courage she'd ever seen evidence of. They brought Lorenzo down from the catwalk in the company of 2 federal agents who treated him with a correctness that was its own form of neutrality. Not roughly, not gently, simply with the efficient handling of someone who had moved from the category of person to the category of case. He walked between them without resistance, without performance. He was, she thought, genuinely tired in a way that people get tired when they've been carrying something heavy for a very long time and have finally, at whatever cost, been relieved of it. He passed Adriano on his way to the vehicle outside. He stopped. The agents on either side registered the pause but allowed it. I should have told you, Lorenzo said. 3 years ago, when I first saw where you were going, I should have said, I'm afraid of where this ends. He looked at Adriano with the stripped-down directness of someone who has nothing left to perform for. I didn't say it because I didn't know how to be afraid in front of you. I never knew how. Adriano said nothing for a moment. You could have learned. Yes. A pause. I could have. He walked on. The door at the far end of the building admitted gray morning light for a moment when it opened, and then it closed, and Lorenzo Grimaldi was gone from the building and from the life that Adriano Viscari had known. Naomi found Reyes sitting on a folded emergency blanket near the east exit, being attended to by someone with actual proper medical training, one of the federal team's medics, and she stood near him for a moment, watching. The rib, she said to the medic without preamble. At minimum 2 fractures. Be careful with compression. The medic looked at her. I'm a paramedic, she said. Wildlife mostly, but the bones are the same. She moved on. She found a corner near one of the building's structural columns where nobody was managing anything, and she stood in it for approximately 4 minutes. This was something she'd learned to do in the field. Find the still point inside a chaotic aftermath and stand in it long enough to let the nervous system understand that the acute phase was over. The body needed that signal. Without it, the adrenaline kept running past its usefulness and curdled into something else. She stood there and breathed and looked at the broken windows and the gray light coming through them, and she let herself feel everything she'd been deferring for the past 22 hours. It was considerable. She'd been used, deliberately, specifically, with forethought, as a tool in someone else's plan. Her route had been known, her habits, her schedule, her fundamental nature. The fact that she would stop, the fact that she would not drive past, had been assessed, cataloged, and weaponized. She'd spent 6 years building a professional relationship with Gerald Park, and that relationship had been compromised 8 months ago by money and fear and someone who knew exactly what her access to Park could be made to produce. She was angry. She let herself be angry. She stood in the corner of an abandoned steel mill with the smell of old rust and lake water around her, and she was genuinely, completely furious in the clean way that comes when you've held something off long enough that when it finally arrives, it arrives at full strength. Then she took a breath and let it begin to move through her, because fury was information, and she'd processed what it was telling her, and she didn't need to carry it past that. She walked back into the main activity of the aftermath. Gerald Park was brought in for federal questioning within the hour. She was present for the initial portion of it, not as a suspect, not as a witness exactly, but as the only person in the room who understood the specific pharmaceutical architecture well enough to confirm what Park was disclosing. She sat across a folding table from a man she'd trusted for 6 years and watched him dismantle everything he'd built for her benefit, piece by piece, with the methodical focus of someone who had made the decision to be completely honest and was going to complete that decision regardless of what it cost. She didn't make it easy for him. She didn't make it hard. She answered what she was asked and confirmed what she could confirm and said, "I don't know," to the things she genuinely didn't know, which was a sufficient number of things that the federal agent running the session started to look at her differently, not with suspicion, but with the slightly recalibrated attention of someone whose initial framework for a situation is undergoing revision. "You had no knowledge of the transfers to Park," the agent said. "Not a question by the end of it." "No." "Or of your route being shared?" "I don't share my field routes. They're determined in real time based on conditions. The only person who knew the timing was Park, because I logged the kit call at 10:40. "And your presence on that highway," she looked at the agent, "was the result of a distress call from a reserve ranger, routed through our dispatch system, logged and time-stamped. You can pull those records." A pause. "I stopped because there was a man bleeding in the road. That's the complete extent of my decision-making." The agent wrote something. "You stopped," he said without looking up. "Most people don't." "I know," she said. That's what they counted on." She was released from the session 4 hours later with a combination of official gratitude and the specific bureaucratic exhaustion that comes from being simultaneously a witness, a potential liability, and a narrative inconvenience to multiple agencies who are still trying to determine what story they're supposed to be telling. She walked out of the temporary federal staging area that had been established in a parking facility 2 blocks from the mill and stood in the first actual daylight she'd seen in what felt like a decade. It was late morning. The storm had moved through completely, and the sky over the lake was the particular washed clean blue that comes after serious weather. Too bright, almost aggressive in its clarity, the kind of sky that doesn't leave room for ambiguity. Dante was waiting by the vehicle. He looked, she thought, approximately as tired as she felt. "Your truck has been recovered," he said, "and your field kit. Your apartment has been assessed. There was a surveillance device installed 3 months ago. It's been removed. You'll want to change your door codes." 3 months ago," she said. "They were watching me for 3 months. 5, actually. The device was the final stage of the preparation. The initial surveillance was physical. She absorbed that. 5 months of her ordinary life. Feeding her neighbor's cat when the neighbor traveled, arguing with the parking enforcement officer who had it in for the space outside her building, the Tuesday morning calls with her mother in Atlanta, observed and recorded and assessed for usefulness. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that directly." He nodded once. "Adriano would like to speak with you before you go." Adriano was in the vehicle. He looked like a man who had been through specific physical and psychological violence in the past 24 hours, because he had been, and unlike the morning in the building where the tiredness had been reorganized into functional urgency, there was nothing left to reorganize it for. He looked exactly as depleted as the situation warranted, which she found, unexpectedly, the most human she'd seen him. He had the phone in his hand, the recording. He looked at it when she got in, then set it on the seat between them. "The federal liaison has a copy," he said. 3 separate copies, different secure locations. The original is going to his office directly." He looked out the window. "It's enough. They've confirmed it's enough. For the prosecution. For the prosecution and for the consortium's exposure in 3 separate jurisdictions. The Luxembourg entity will collapse inside 6 months. The parent company has already started distancing itself. They moved assets this morning, which is itself evidence." He sounded like a man reading a report he's already finished being surprised by. "It's done. And the organization. Dismantled. He said the word with the flatness of someone who has said something so many times in preparation for saying it out loud that the word has lost its texture. The transition has been in process for 18 months. The legitimate holdings, real estate, development, hospitality, those continue under proper corporate structure. The rest is being surrendered as part of the cooperation agreement. You've been building this for 18 months. I've been building the exit. Lorenzo spent 16 months building the trap, and I spent 18 months building the door. He paused. I didn't know about Lorenzo. Not specifically. I knew someone was working against the transition because the resistance was too organized to be organic. I didn't know it was him. She thought about what that cost him to say, the specific arithmetic of it. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her. For what? For the thing you lost. That isn't the same as what he did to you. Those are separate griefs. He was quiet for a moment. The vehicle moved around them. Dante was driving, taking them back toward the city, toward the version of the day that came after all of this. You're an unusual person, he said finally. I've been told. I mean that precisely. Not as a compliment exactly, as an observation. He turned to look out the window again. You were placed in my path as a mechanism, and you became something else. Entirely through your own decisions, made without full information, in real time. He paused. I've spent 20 years in a world where people perform loyalty and perform threat and perform every other thing that gets them what they want. I'd stopped expecting anything to be what it appeared to be. I'm exactly what I appear to be, she said. It's not a virtue. I just never had the energy for the other thing. He almost smiled. It didn't fully form, but the architecture of it was there. What do you need, right now, practically? My truck back. The ability to return to my job, assuming the program still exists and my position hasn't been declared compromised by association. I've already had someone address that. Your program director received a notification this morning from the Regional Wildlife Authority confirming that you were assisting in a federal investigation and that your work was in no way under question. A pause. I also made a financial contribution to the Emergency Wildlife Fund. Substantial enough that the program will have operating budget for the next 4 years without grant dependency. She looked at him. You're not allowed to refuse it, he said. It's a donation to the program, not to you. The animals don't have opinions about where the money comes from. She thought about arguing. She decided not to. Fine. And the apartment. If you want to move, I'll handle the apartment, she said. I've lived there for 9 years. I'm not letting someone else's surveillance run me out of it. He nodded. He'd expected that answer, she thought. They drove in silence for a moment that was different from all the previous silences. Less charged. Something in it that was closer to ordinary. 2 people in a car after something enormous, finding their way back toward the register of regular existence. What happens to you? She said. He took a breath. The cooperation agreement provides for a structured personal legal arrangement. I'm not going to prison. The contribution to the federal case is significant enough that personal criminal exposure has been managed, but I'll be under oversight for some time. Travel restrictions, financial monitoring. He paused. I've accepted that. I accepted it 18 months ago when I started the process, and after the oversight. I have some ideas. He said it simply, without fanfare. There are things I know how to do that have applications outside the context I've been doing them in. Management of complex organizations. Financial architecture, crisis response coordination. A pause. And I've been thinking about something specific for a while. Something specific. A foundation. Emergency medical and community support. Focused on communities that have historically been managed through fear rather than supported through resources. He said this carefully, like a man who has rehearsed it enough to know where the sentimental language lives and has removed it. Wildlife emergency support is part of the program. Because the work you do, the intersection of community health and environmental health, it's underfunded to a degree that seems like a policy choice rather than an oversight. She looked at him. You want to build a foundation. I want to do something that doesn't require me to be a different person than I'm currently trying to be. He met her eyes. That's the honest version. She sat with that. The city was fully visible now, rising around the highway on both sides. The ordinary, extraordinary fact of Chicago in late morning, traffic and architecture and the lake glinting in the October light through the breaks between buildings. I don't want anything to do with the management of it, she said. I'm not asking you to. I mean, if you build it, I'm not a co-founder or an advisor or any other title that connects my name to yours in an official capacity. I have a career and a professional reputation, and I intend to keep both intact. Understood. But if the wildlife emergency component needs subject matter guidance from a working professional in the field, I'll give you 30 minutes on the phone and I won't charge you for it. He looked at her. That's an extraordinarily modest concession. I'm an extraordinarily modest person. This time the smile did form. Brief, genuine, carrying something of the previous 24 hours in it and something older than that, something that had been waiting for the right conditions. It lasted a few seconds, and then it settled back into the particular composed gravity that was his default register. She thought, there he is. The actual person, underneath the boss and the wounded man and the man carrying 18 months of secret dismantling. Just there, briefly. She thought, that's enough. That's sufficient. I don't need to know the rest. Dante dropped her at her truck. It was in a city lot 4 blocks from the location she'd last left it, which meant someone had driven it in from the wildlife preserve, and she chose not to think too carefully about who had access to her keys during that process. It smelled right, antiseptic and pine, her smell, the smell of the work she'd built her life around. And when she turned the key and the engine caught on the first try, she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was still held. She sat in the truck for a moment before she put it in drive. She pulled out her phone. 11 missed calls. She'd been ignoring the phone through the federal session and hadn't looked at it since. Most of them were from her program director, whose voicemails she could summarize without listening, concerned, then more concerned, then the registering of the authority notification, then the financial donation news, then something warmer and more confused. 2 calls from a colleague who'd covered her scheduled morning calls. One from her mother, who had not left a voicemail because her mother considered voicemail an imposition. She called her mother. 3 rings. Naomi. Hey, Mama. You sound tired. I am tired. Are you all right? She thought about the highway and the rain and the man on his hands and knees and the decision to slow down, the ranger station and the wound and the words. We've secured the perimeter, rearranging everything she'd understood about the previous 2 hours. The building, the catwalk, the sound of a gun on metal grating, Lorenzo's face, Adriano's face, the specific weight of her own hands in a maintenance corridor, working with the insufficient tools she had because they were the only tools available. Yeah, she said, I'm all right. You sure? I'm sure. A pause. Her mother had the particular patience of a woman who had raised 2 children and survived sufficient things to know the difference between a reassurance that needed to be pushed and one that needed to be received. Okay, her mother said. Come home sometime soon. I will. I promise. She hung up and pulled out of the lot. The weeks that followed had the quality that extreme events always leave in their wake. An almost aggressive normality, the world insisting on its own continuation with the slightly too bright clarity of the sky after the storm. She returned to work on a Tuesday, 3 days after the mill. Her truck. Her kit. A juvenile coyote with a leg injury near the Des Plaines River. She treated it in the field with Benny, her most reliable volunteer, who did not ask her where she'd been because she'd told him a version of it that was accurate in its outlines and vague in its specifics, and who received this with the particular grace of someone who understands that some things are held rather than shared. The federal case developed publicly over the following weeks. She read the coverage with the specific relationship that people have to news stories they were inside. The way the details were slightly wrong in ways that only she could know. The way the narrative simplified what had been complex. The way certain names appeared and others didn't, and the spaces where the names weren't were visible to her like gaps in a photograph. Lorenzo Grimaldi was named. The consortium was named. The full architecture of what had been planned was laid out in a federal filing that was publicly available and which she read once, completely, at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a cup of tea going cold beside her. She read Caruso's statement. He had cooperated fully, which was consistent with what she'd seen of him in the building, which was a man who'd spent 11 months doing something he hadn't finished believing in and had found the moment to stop. The statement was dry and procedural in the way legal documents are, but underneath the language she could hear the shape of what she'd read in him on the catwalk. In the beginning, all of it. She did not read Adriano's cooperation documentation. She knew it existed. She didn't seek it. He reached out twice in the month following, once through Dante, with a logistical question about the wildlife program donation structure. Genuine, brief, forwarded to her program director with her blessing. Once directly, a text message, 6 words. The foundation is in formation. Thank you. She read it 3 times. She typed, good luck with it, sent it, put the phone down. The wildlife emergency component of the Adriano Vescari Foundation, formally established under a name that honored his father's legitimate business history rather than his own, was announced in late autumn. She read the press release. The programming language was accurate in ways that told her someone had spoken to someone who knew the field, though her name appeared nowhere in the documentation. She had given him 30 minutes on the phone in early October, as promised, and she had been specific and practical and had charged him nothing. And the call had lasted 41 minutes rather than 30 because one of his questions had been about emergency triage protocols for animals displaced by community violence, which was a question she hadn't expected and which had required a real answer. She hadn't asked how he was doing. He hadn't asked how she was doing. They'd spoken about the work, which was perhaps the most honest form of conversation available to 2 people in their specific circumstance. October deepened into itself. The forest preserves went gold and then rust, and then bare in the way they always did, the cycle so familiar it had become the primary way she marked time. She drove the western reserves in the late afternoons when the light was horizontal and the shadows of the bare trees made long lines across the fields. And she thought about the things that happened to people when they made one decision rather than another, about how a life could pivot in the 40 seconds it took to slow a truck to a stop on a rain-wet highway. She didn't regret it. She'd asked herself whether she would, and the honest answer was no, which surprised her slightly, and then didn't. She'd been who she was in every moment of those 22 hours, no more and no less. And if who she was had been useful to someone else's survival and someone else's long-delayed reckoning with himself, she could hold that without needing it to be something larger than it was. The lone highway on the western perimeter of the forest preserve, the one where it had started, the specific stretch of road, she drove it on a Thursday evening in mid-October without planning to. She was returning from an assessment call, and the route was convenient, and she took it the way she always took convenient routes, without ceremony. She slowed when she reached the spot. She couldn't have said exactly why. The road looked like every other section of that highway. The median barrier had been repaired. There was no visible evidence of what had happened on this stretch of asphalt on a rainy night several weeks ago. She stopped the truck. She sat for a moment in the quiet engine-off silence and looked at the tree line where 3 men in black gear had emerged, and at the asphalt where a man had been on his hands and knees, and at the shoulder where she'd parked and made the decision. She thought about all the nights she'd driven past things, and what those things had been, and what it had cost the world, and what it had cost her specifically to be the kind of person who sometimes didn't drive past. She thought about what Lorenzo had called it: weak, soft, a contamination. She thought about the look on Adriano's face in the vehicle that morning. I'd stopped expecting anything to be what it appeared to be, and what it meant to have that reversed, even partially, even impermanently, even at the cost of everything the last 22 hours had required. She started the truck. She pulled back onto the highway. The road opened ahead of her in the October evening, straight and familiar, the trees on either side stripped to their structure. The sky above them the deep, clean blue of a season that had committed to its own change. She drove with one hand on the wheel and the window cracked despite the cold because she liked the smell of the preserve in this season, the specific combination of leaf decay and open water, and the kind of cold that meant something was ending in order for something else to begin. She wasn't thinking about Adriano when her phone showed his name on the screen. She almost didn't answer because she was driving and the road required attention, and also because she wasn't sure what she would say to him, and then she answered because she'd never been the kind of person who drove past things. "Hey," she said. "I'm on the highway," he said. "Your highway. The Western Preserve Road." She looked at her mirrors instinctively. "I'm on it too." A pause. "I know," he said. "I saw your truck." She looked in the mirror again. Headlights, a quarter-mile back. Not armored. Not a convoy. One vehicle, moving at normal speed. "Are you alone?" she said. "Yes." She drove for another 30 seconds. The headlights maintained their distance. No bodyguards. No Dante. No organization, no infrastructure, no layer of purpose or security between him and the ordinary world. She pulled to the shoulder. He pulled up behind her. They got out of their respective vehicles and stood on the gravel in the cold October evening with the forest on both sides and the sky going dark above the tree line. And it was nothing like the night it had happened on this road. No rain, no sirens, no blood, no men emerging from the trees. Just two people standing in the late light of an autumn evening on a stretch of highway that had cost them both something significant. He looked different, not drastically. He carried himself with the same stillness she'd cataloged from the beginning, but the weight of it was different. Something had been set down. The perpetual low-level calculation she'd read in him since the ranger station, the assessment of every room, every person, every angle, was quieter. Not gone. Quieter. "You look better," she said. "I feel approximately 30% better," he said, "which my surgeon tells me is ahead of schedule." "You saw a real surgeon. I saw 3 of them. There was a consensus." She almost smiled. "How's the arm?" "Functional, sore in the cold." He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "How are you?" She thought about giving him the same answer she'd given her mother. She found she didn't want to. "Better than I was, still processing some of it." She looked at the tree line. "The surveillance bothers me more than the physical stuff, knowing I was watched for 5 months. I understand that." "I don't think you do, actually. Not exactly." She said it without hostility, just accurately. "Your whole life has been watched. Mine was ordinary, and then it wasn't. And the ordinary part got used against me. That's a specific thing." He considered that. "You're right. I don't understand it the same way." A pause. "I'm sorry for it." "You didn't do it." "No. But the world I was part of built the conditions for it." He looked at her directly. "I'll carry that." She nodded. That was the right answer. Not a deflection and not an overclaim. She respected it. They stood for a moment in the quiet of the road and the woods and the enormous, uncomplicated fact of the evening going about its business around them. "The foundation launch is in December," he said. "I won't ask you to attend. I know you won't want to." "I won't want to. But I wanted you to know the date, in case you read about it somewhere and wondered." He paused. "The Wildlife Emergency Division has a program director now, someone with field experience. She's good." "She?" "Dr. Yemi Okafor, you might know her work." She did know her work. She knew it well. She stood on the gravel and felt something shift in the region of her chest that she wasn't going to name too specifically because she didn't need to. "That's a good choice," she said. "I had guidance." "You had a 41-minute phone call." "It was useful guidance." The last of the direct light left the sky above the tree line. The blue deepened. In the forest around them, something moved, something small, in the undergrowth, a sound she identified without looking as a white-tailed deer moving through the dry leaves. And the sound passed, and the quiet came back. "I should go," she said. She didn't move immediately. "Yes," he said. He didn't move either. They stood for another moment in the particular way of two people who have been through something that doesn't have a clean social protocol, who have occupied the same extreme circumstances and emerged on parallel tracks that run close without converging, and who are both honest enough to stand in that truth, rather than reshape it into something easier. "The greatest decision of my life," he said quietly, not looking at her, looking at the road, "was made before I knew your name." She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her. She thought about what that meant, not sentimentally, not in the register of easy stories, but in the actual weight of it. A man who had decided, 18 months before a rainy highway, that he was going to do something costly and irreversible because it was the right thing and not for any other reason, and a woman who had stopped on a shoulder in the dark because that was who she was, and the intersection of those two decisions in one specific place at one specific time. Not magic, not fate, not the narrative convenience of two people meant to find each other, but just the unglamorous, extraordinary fact of what happens when a person acts like the person they actually are. "Go build your foundation," she said. He nodded. Something in his face settled. Not closed, settled. The way things settle when they're in the right place. He got back in his car. She got back in her truck. She pulled onto the highway first, and he followed for a quarter mile before the road split, and he took the branch that led back toward the city, and she took the branch that led deeper into the preserve. And that was how they went, in separate directions, on a road that had cost them both something real, toward whatever ordinary, extraordinary thing came next. She drove with the window still cracked. The cold air carried the smell of the preserve, leaves and water, and the honest dark of a forest in October. And she drove through it with her hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and the particular quality of alive that only comes from having been somewhere close to the opposite. She did not look in the mirror. She kept driving.